Hello, hello. In this very short video, I'll show you how I would approach making a wet skin shader. This particular shader is like a moist skin shader, so think you got out of a pool like a minute ago. If your character was absolutely drenched, you might want to do some additional things. In particular, you'd probably want a drip effect, and you'd probably want some surface water with a geometry node setup or just modeling it in as an object. I'll make a separate video on that if there is a demand for it. Okay, so before I get into the wet skin part, I think I should briefly go over my skin shader. It's honestly very simple. I basically have a base color which I mix with a skin texture. Then I distort that color a bit with a Voronoi texture. This is the same texture that is used on the bump map for this model, which is basically meant to simulate the effect of pores. And then I finally add this layer weight effect, which kind of adds some definition to the edges of the model. Yeah, that's pretty much it for my skin shader. Let's talk about the wet part now. So the first part of the wet skin shader is the Fresnel. Objects that are really reflective have a high Fresnel value, so that's why I'm using it here. The Fresnel is effectively going to act like a mask for a wetness effect. By the way, I should mention that I've tuned the Fresnel to like 0.7. I'm not sure if this is physically accurate, but this is what looked the best to me, so that's what I'm going with. The next mask is a sort of wetness mask. It's basically meant to mask out the areas that are supposed to be wet. In this case, I'm just using an image texture for this. And this image texture gets multiplied with the Fresnel. Subsequently, we multiply that result with the pore mask, and that gives us a mask for which part of the model should be shiny. Okay, now let's put it all together. So first I use an overlay node on the skin with the wetness mask as the input to the factor and a bluish color as the input color. This basically just tints the areas that are wet a little bit blue. Next, I use a linear light node with the shininess map that we just calculated as input into the factor and just plain white as the input color. So this just tints the areas that are shiny towards white. And the last node that I have is the exact same thing, but I just did it twice basically to make the effect more harsh. So that's how the color is calculated, but there's still more to go. From the roughness map of the model, I subtract the shininess map. So this should make the areas that are shiny very non-rough. And to the height of the bump map, I also add the shininess map. I also passed it through a power node to make it a little bit more harsh. This should make it so that the pores in the shiny area stick out a little bit more. And one more thing that I did is that I passed the shininess map to the weight of the clear coat. This is intended to make it look like there's a sort of film of water on the wet areas. And yeah, that's it for the skin shader, but let's quickly also look at how to make the droplets that I have here. I didn't feel like making a crazy setup today, so I just went with the most lazy ass solution that I could think of. So in this case, we're literally just scattering a bunch of UV spheres on our model. Now you could do all sorts of things here. You could animate them dripping, you could distort them, but I think this effect looks decent enough. Only thing I want to point out here is that I used a vertex group to control where the density of the droplet should be highest. But other than that, I think this is so basic and so simple you don't need me to explain this. One more thing I want to mention, if you're making wet clothes, usually the rule with the wet stuff is that it gets more saturated the more wet it is. With skin, this doesn't actually appear to be the case though. I think the reason is that the water sort of doesn't seep into the skin. It just forms a film on the skin and it makes it more reflective. So yeah, for objects that absorb water, you usually want to up the saturation instead of focusing so much on the reflectivity. Alright, and with that, I'll see you next time.